The order of battle of Australian forces during the Vietnam War consisted of a small group of military advisors from 1962, but grew to include an infantry battalion based in Bien Hoa in 1965. This force was then replaced by a 2 and later 3 battalion task force with supporting arms based at Nui Dat, which operated primarily in Phuoc Tuy province between 1966 to 71. With logistic elements of Vung Tau. Air Force units committed initially consisted of transport aircraft but were followed by helicopters and later bombers, while naval forces included destroyers and transport vessels. With the size of Australian forces in Vietnam reaching a peak in early 1968, a drawdown commenced in late 1970. With the bulk withdrawn by early 1972. The last elements returned to Australia in 1973. In total, around 50,000 Australians served during the Vietnam War, including 42,437 members of the Australian Army, 3,310 from the Royal Australian Navy, and 4,443 from the Royal Australian Air Force, with casualties including 519 killed and 2,348 wounded. Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, Saigon. Australian Army Force Vietnam, Saigon. 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment Battle Group, Bien Hoa 1st APC Troop, M113 Armoured Personnel Carriers 105th Field Battery, Royal Australian Artillery 3rd Field Troop 161st Reconnaissance Flight, Bell Suix Light Observation Helicopters and Cessna 180s, Bien Hoa. Australian Logistic Support Company, Bien Hoa. Australian Force Vietnam, Saigon. 1st Australian Task Force, Nui Dat Infantry, Royal Australian Regiment. 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment 2nd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment 3rd Battalion, a Royal Australian Regiment 4th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment 5th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment 6th Battalion, a Royal Australian Regiment 7th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment 8th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment 9th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment Special Air Service Regiment. 1st Squadron, 2nd Squadron, 3rd Squadron Armour, 1st APC Squadron, M113 Armoured Personnel Carriers A Squadron, 3rd Cavalry Regiment, M113 Armoured Personnel Carriers B Squadron, 3rd Cavalry Regiment, M113 Armoured Personnel Carriers A Squadron, 1st Armoured Regiment, Centurion Tanks B Squadron, 1st Armoured Regiment, Centurion Tanks C Squadron, 1st Armoured Regiment, Centurion Tanks Detachment, 1st Forward Delivery Troop Artillery, 1st Field Regiment, a Royal Australian Artillery 101st Field Battery, a Royal Australian Artillery 103rd Field Battery, Royal Australian Artillery 105th Field Battery, a Royal Australian Artillery 4th Field Regiment, a Royal Australian Artillery 106th Field Battery, Royal Australian Artillery 107th Field Battery, a Royal Australian Artillery 108th Field Battery, a Royal Australian Artillery 12th Field Regiment, Royal Australian Artillery A Field Battery, a Royal Australian Artillery 102nd Field Battery, a Royal Australian Artillery 104th Field Battery, Royal Australian Artillery 131st Divisional Locating Battery, a Royal Australian Artillery Engineers, 1st Field Squadron 21st Engineers Support Troop Aviation, 161st Reconnaissance Flight Bell Suix Light Observation Helicopters, Cessna 180s, Cessna Bird Dog and Pilatus Porters, Vung Tau, Nui Dat Intelligence Detachment, 1st Divisional Intelligence Unit, 1st Psychological Operations Unit, 1st Australian Logistics Support Group, Vung Tau, 1st Australian Civil Affairs Unit, Nui Dat and Vung Tau, Royal Australian Air Force, Transport. RAF Transport Flight Vietnam, DHC-4 Caraboose, Butterworth, Vung Tau No. 35 Squadron RAF DHC-4 Caraboose, Vung Tau. Helicopter. No. 9 Squadron RAF UH-1 Iroquois, Vung Tau. Bomber. No. 2 Squadron RAF English Electric Canberras, Phan Ran. Other units. No. 1 Operational Support Unit. No. 5 Airfield Construction Squadron RAF, Royal Australian Navy. Destroyers. HMAS Brisbane, HMAS Perth, HMAS Hobart, HMAS Vendetta. Supply and Transport. HMAS Chaparral, HMAS Boonaroo, HMAS Sydney. Other units. Clearance Diving Team 3 Vung Tau Ran Helicopter Flight Vietnam, UH-1 Iroquois, Vung Tau, Black Horse Bearcat, Dong Tam.